Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky walked into that brig and started recruiting. The guards thought he had lost his mind. The commanding officer demanded an explanation. Tachovsky's fellow officers warned him that building a unit from disciplinary cases was suicide with extra steps. Every manual, every tradition, every principle of military organization said that elite units required discipline above all else. You built warriors from obedient men who followed orders without question. Tachovsky didn't want obedient men. He wanted the ones who threw the first punch and won. On June 15, 1944, 40 of those men landed on Saipan with Tachovsky leading them. They were the Scout-Sniper Platoon of the 6th Marine Regiment. They were also criminals, troublemakers, and fighters who had been given one chance to redeem themselves in combat. What they did over the next 3 weeks would change how the Marine Corps fought. It would influence the creation of Navy SEALs. It would prove that the most dangerous soldiers weren't the ones who followed rules. They were the ones who knew when to break them. The idea came to Tachovsky in late 1943. The Pacific Campaign was grinding forward, island by island, and the cost in American lives was staggering. Japanese defenders fought from prepared positions, dug into caves and bunkers that absorbed artillery and naval gunfire without effect. American Marines were walking into ambushes because they had no idea what lay ahead. The Corps needed reconnaissance. They needed men who could operate ahead of the main force, behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that would save lives. But the missions required something that traditional Marine training didn't produce. The missions required men who could think for themselves. Standard Marine doctrine emphasized unit cohesion and obedience. A Marine followed orders. He moved when his sergeant said move. He fired when his corporal said fire. He trusted that his officers knew the tactical situation and would make the right decisions. This system worked brilliantly for conventional operations, where commanders could see the battlefield and issue real-time orders. It didn't work for reconnaissance. A reconnaissance team operating behind enemy lines couldn't radio for instructions every time they encountered a decision point. Communications were unreliable. The tactical situation changed by the minute. A team that waited for orders would be captured or killed while waiting. They needed to make independent decisions, adapt to circumstances, and trust their own judgment. Tachovsky realized that the Marines most likely to think independently were the Marines most likely to get in trouble. The men who questioned orders. The men who acted on instinct rather than waiting for permission. The men who sat in the brig because they had decided that punching a sergeant was worth the consequences. He started looking for winners. The selection process was unconventional. Tachovsky visited punishment details in brigs across Hawaii, interviewing Marines who were awaiting discipline. He didn't ask about their crimes. He asked about their fights. When 2 Marines got into a fight, the winner went to the brig. The loser went to the infirmary. Tachovsky wanted the winners. He asked about their backgrounds. Many of them had grown up hunting, fishing, and surviving in rural areas where self-reliance was mandatory. They knew how to move quietly through woods. They knew how to track animals. They knew how to live off the land when necessary. He asked about their attitudes. The men who interested him weren't the ones who apologized for their behavior. They were the ones who explained their reasoning and stood by their decisions. They might have been wrong. They might have broken regulations. But they had made choices based on their own judgment, and they weren't ashamed of that. Over several months, Tachovsky assembled 40 men who met his criteria. Fighters, survivors, independent thinkers, criminals by Marine Corps standards, the nucleus of what would become the most effective reconnaissance unit in the Pacific. The senior officers who approved the experiment did so with reservations. Some of them expected the unit to self-destruct, 40 troublemakers thrown together without the normal structure of Marine discipline. They would fight each other. They would refuse orders. They would prove that the Marine Corps was right to lock them up. Tachovsky had different expectations. He understood something about the men he had recruited. They weren't undisciplined. They were selectively disciplined. They followed rules that made sense to them and ignored rules that didn't. The key was giving them rules that made sense. Training began at Camp Tarawa. The methods were unconventional, designed to develop exactly the skills that Tachovsky believed his missions would require. Stealth was paramount. The men practiced moving through terrain without making sound, approaching mock enemy positions without being detected. They learned to communicate with hand signals that conveyed complex tactical information in silence. They practiced lying motionless for hours, controlling their breathing, becoming invisible in landscapes where visibility meant death. Marksmanship was intensive. Every man was trained as a sniper, capable of precision shooting at ranges that most infantry never attempted. They zeroed their weapons personally and maintained them obsessively. A rifle that misfired behind enemy lines meant death. Survival skills were tested ruthlessly. The men were dropped in the wilderness with minimal supplies and expected to sustain themselves for days. They learned to find water, identify edible plants, and create shelters from natural materials. The jungle was not their enemy. It was their home. But the most important training was psychological. Tachovsky drilled into his men that they would operate without direct supervision. They would make decisions that could get them killed or save their lives, and no officer would be looking over their shoulder. They had to trust their own judgment absolutely. The men who had been locked up for trusting their own judgment discovered that the same quality that had gotten them in trouble was now their greatest asset. The platoon received its nickname organically. Someone called them the 40 Thieves, a reference to the Arabian Nights story about the outlaw band who operated outside the law. The name stuck. It captured everything about the unit, their criminal backgrounds, their unconventional methods, and their absolute loyalty to each other. Saipan was their first major test. The island held approximately 30,000 Japanese defenders. The American invasion force was massive, but even massive forces can walk into ambushes. The commanders needed to know where the Japanese were concentrated, where their artillery was positioned, how their defensive lines were organized. The 40 Thieves were tasked with finding out. On the night of June 16, small teams from the Scout-Sniper Platoon began infiltrating behind Japanese lines. They moved in groups of 3 to 5 men, traveling light, carrying only weapons, ammunition, water, and minimal food. They would be operating independently for days. The first mission nearly ended in disaster. A team led by Corporal Joseph Tyre encountered a Japanese patrol approximately 2 miles behind the enemy's main line. Standard procedure would have required Tyre to avoid contact, to remain undetected, to complete his reconnaissance mission without engaging. Tyre made a different decision. The Japanese patrol was heading toward a ravine where another American reconnaissance team was believed to be operating. If Tyre let them pass, they might discover his fellow Marines. He decided to eliminate the patrol. The engagement lasted approximately 30 seconds. Tyre's team killed 5 Japanese soldiers with silent weapons and knives, then concealed the bodies and continued their mission. No alarm was raised. No reinforcements arrived. The decision had been Tyre's alone. No officer had authorized it. No radio communication had requested guidance. A Marine trained in traditional doctrine would have waited for orders, and while waiting, his fellow Marines in the ravine would have been discovered and killed. Tyre's independent judgment saved lives. The reports that came back from the 40 Thieves transformed the American understanding of Japanese defenses on Saipan. They identified artillery positions that naval gunfire subsequently destroyed. They located hidden ammunition depots that became targets for airstrikes. They mapped the defensive lines that allowed American commanders to concentrate forces against weak points. More importantly, they demonstrated that the concept worked. Men who had been called criminals, troublemakers, and discipline problems were operating successfully in the most demanding combat environment imaginable. They were making independent decisions under pressure and making them correctly. They were proving that the Marine Corps had been wrong about what made an elite soldier. The Battle of Saipan lasted 3 weeks. The 40 Thieves operated throughout, conducting reconnaissance missions that ranged from a few hours to several days. They suffered casualties. War kills the skilled alongside the unlucky. But the unit maintained its effectiveness until the island was secured. By the time Saipan fell, senior officers who had dismissed Tachovsky's experiment were requesting similar units for their own commands. The success was undeniable. The doctrine that said elite soldiers required absolute obedience had been challenged by men who were elite precisely because they didn't obey absolutely. The tactics that the 40 Thieves pioneered spread through the Pacific Theater. Other units adopted their methods of deep reconnaissance, silent operations, and independent decision-making. The Marine Corps began officially developing Scout-Sniper doctrine that incorporated lessons learned on Saipan. The ripples extended beyond World War II. When the United States Navy created the SEALs in 1962, they built the force around principles that the 40 Thieves had demonstrated 2 decades earlier. Small unit operations behind enemy lines, independent decision-making by operators on the ground, selection criteria that valued adaptability and initiative over rigid obedience. The connection wasn't accidental. Many of the officers who developed SEAL doctrine had studied Pacific War reconnaissance operations. They had read the reports from Saipan. They understood that elite unconventional forces required unconventional soldiers. Marine Force Reconnaissance, established in 1957, drew even more directly from the 40 Thieves' legacy. The mission profile, deep reconnaissance behind enemy lines, was identical. The selection process, identifying Marines with independent thinking and survival skills, was borrowed directly. The training methods, stealth, marksmanship, and psychological preparation for operating alone, followed the template that Tachovsky had created. Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky survived the war. He returned to civilian life and rarely spoke publicly about his unconventional unit. The men who had served under him scattered across the country, carrying their experiences in ways that shaped their post-war lives. Some of them stayed in the military and helped develop the reconnaissance units that followed. Some of them returned to civilian life and applied the same independent thinking that had made them effective behind enemy lines. A few of them ended up back in trouble, because the qualities that made excellent reconnaissance Marines didn't always translate to peacetime behavior. But they had proven something that the military establishment had resisted accepting. Elite soldiers weren't made through discipline alone. They were made through selection, finding men whose natural inclinations matched the demands of unconventional warfare, and through training that developed those inclinations rather than suppressing them. The Brig Marines, the criminals, the fighters who won, they had been exactly what Tachovsky needed. Their refusal to accept authority blindly had made them problems in garrison. It had made them survivors in combat. The modern special operations community understands this lesson. Navy SEAL selection doesn't just test physical endurance. It tests psychological flexibility, the ability to make decisions under pressure, the willingness to act without waiting for permission. The qualities that Tachovsky identified in 1943 remain central to how elite forces are built today. The 40 Thieves were never officially recognized as pioneers of special operations doctrine. The Marine Corps didn't issue a manual crediting troublemakers with revolutionizing reconnaissance warfare. The connection between a brig in Hawaii and the Navy SEALs of the 21st century isn't taught in history classes. But the lineage is clear. A lieutenant who understood that obedience and effectiveness weren't the same thing. 40 men who had proven they could think for themselves even when thinking for themselves got them in trouble. A battle where independent judgment meant the difference between intelligence and ignorance, between lives saved and lives lost. They called them criminals. They called Tachovsky's experiment suicide. They said elite units required discipline above all else. They were wrong about all of it. The 40 Thieves proved that sometimes the best soldiers are the ones the system wants to throw away. The men who question orders might be the men who know when orders are wrong. The fighters who end up in the brig might be the fighters you want when fighting is all that matters. Tachovsky didn't break the rules. He found men who understood that rules were tools, not masters. He gave them a mission that required exactly the qualities that had gotten them in trouble. And he proved that the worst Marines in the brig could become the best Marines behind enemy lines. 40 criminals against 30,000 Japanese defenders. Suicide with extra steps, the officers said. The 40 Thieves called it Tuesday. They didn't just survive. They revolutionized warfare. They created the template for every elite reconnaissance unit that followed. They proved that the manual was wrong, that discipline wasn't everything, that independent thinking could be trained and channeled rather than punished and suppressed. When a Navy SEAL operates today, making split-second decisions without waiting for authorization, he's following a doctrine that 40 troublemakers established on Saipan in 1944. When a Marine Force Recon team moves silently behind enemy lines, they're using techniques that criminals developed at Camp Tarawa. The Brig Marines became the model for elite soldiers everywhere, not despite their problems, because of them. If the story of the 40 thieves hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm that unconventional heroes who built modern special operations deserve to be remembered. If you're not subscribed, now is the time, because next week we're uncovering another group of outcasts who proved the military establishment catastrophically wrong. Drop a comment and answer honestly. If you were building an elite unit, would you recruit from the disciplined soldiers or from the fighters in the brig? I want to know. I'll see you in the next one.